Welcome to the Experts in Sport podcast, brought to you by the School of Sport, Exercise and Health Sciences at Loughborough University. Hi Karl, hi Denise, thanks for joining me on the podcast.
Hi Martin.
Morning.
Good morning. So Karl's been on a few times before and Denise, we'll have an intro from you in a moment. But for listeners who've already heard Karl before, or for those who haven't, Karl was involved in episode 1, so sport psychology at the elite level. So that is our most listened to podcast. So we're piling the pressure on already, Denise. So that is our most listened to. Another very popular one that Karl was on was building psychological strength through the 5 C's. So that was episode 40. But I'm not sure we've touched in much detail about Karl's background in golf. So
hang on, Martin, you're missing the most important one that I did with Jamie Barker on why Ole Gunnar Solskjaer was such a quality manager at Man United. Did that never go out?
It is an amusing topic, and we should probably comedy release it. So just for listeners, we're going to talk about this in a moment, but Karl, Denise and Jamie are releasing a book soon. They're the 3 editors. We've banned Jamie from being on the podcast because last time he was on, it was so terrible it's still in the bin. That's not the truth. Jamie couldn't make it today. But yeah, there was a podcast where Jamie predicted that Ole Gunnar Solskjaer was the Messiah and Manchester United were going to rise from the ashes, and they pretty much lost every game after he said that. Yeah. So we've kept that in the archives at the moment, but we might bring it out for, I don't know, maybe for Jamie's birthday or something in the future. But yeah, so we have done others. But today we're going to focus on performance under pressure and choking. But can our listeners just learn a little bit about your history, Karl, with golf and your present?
Yeah, I guess I'm a psychologist because I wasn't the golfer I wanted to be. So I was a golf professional in a previous life, a club pro, aspirations of, playing on tours and things like that, but was a million miles away from that. But had a really nice career coaching and playing a little bit on local tours. But I think for me, whilst I had a golf swing that looked pretty good through a camera, for me, the mental side was always a struggle. And so a game that I absolutely loved as a kid became a game that petrified me. And I couldn't wait to get off the golf course, which was really, really, really sad in some ways because it was such a big part of my life. And then when I was coaching, I never felt like I was helping people because I always felt that it was the psychological side, not the fear, but just how people learn. So I just got more and more interested in that. It started as self-help, doing an evening class. And then before I knew it, I was enrolled on a degree, then master's degree. And I can't remember when I stopped playing, but it was a long time ago. And now full circle. My PhD was in an area of golf, and Denise kindly was my external examiner on that. So I've known Denise for a fair while now. And now as an applied practitioner, it's only in the last 2 or 3 years that I've come back to golf. And I work with men and women on the European and PGA tours. So that's probably the whiz through. So just come back to golf recently after about a 15-year absence.
Brilliant. We'll dig into it more soon. And Denise, can you give us a bit of background around your research as well as your golf experience?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, isn't it funny that I'm just smiling there because everyone who gets into golf psychology is a failed golfer or an injured footballer. Seems to be the way forward. So very similar really to Karl in that I was a frustrated golfer. Again, I look good for the cameras, but I couldn't put the scores together because, I was labelled very early on a choker. Very kindly by my selectors. It's not, I'm over it. I'm not bitter and twisted. So I did play at an international level, and to be honest, it was quite early doors that I realised I wasn't going to earn millions on the LPGA tour and live my life in Florida. So I had to find a different way. And actually, I got to be honest, it was at Loughborough. Where I did my degree. I thought I was going to become a physiotherapist. And in one of the final lectures of my degree, Professor Graham Jones walked in swinging a cricket bat and started talking about his work with Robin Smith, the cricketer. I'm aging myself now. People listen to this and go, ooh. He was talking about cricketers who he was working with who choked under pressure, and all of a sudden can my ears light up? Well, they did. Listen to this, go, that's me, he's talking about me, that's what I did in golf, blah, blah, blah. So actually, it was at that point very late that I changed direction in what I wanted to do, and I did a master's in sport and exercise psychology to find out more. So it was a very self-serving process, because I went from the master's then to, research a little bit more, eventually onto the PhD, which was all about choking under pressure in golf, and working with people who were professional but on the fringes, because as soon as the pressure was put on, they choked. What was really interesting though at this time, so we're talking about 2001, 2, 3, whatever, there was a lot of research out on choking by Barlick and Carr and that group, great research. But what they were talking about didn't resonate with my personal experiences or the experiences of the golfers I started to work with and talk to and complete interviews with. There seems to be a disconnect between what the research was saying choking is and what athletes were feeling choking is, if that makes any kind of sense. Yeah. So that's what drove me really to kind of like delve into and reconceptualize what choking under pressure is, what causes it, in a more phenomenological way, so a more real life way rather than in the lab. And we've gone from there. So it's very much informed my practice, this research base. We now have a pretty decent understanding, but not perfect understanding of what choking is and this phenomena. And that drives my work with, I work across sports, but mainly in golf, I have to say, through the amateur ranks through to the DP World Tour and obviously the European Tour for the ladies. And I live vicariously through them. I got to be honest, it's the best job. Researching sports psychology, researching what can be quite a depressing subject. It's not exactly uplifting, choking, but and then working with golfers and living vicariously through their success. I've absolutely landed, I got to be honest. I love it. So I am a bit worried that I can talk about it to death and we've only got an hour. So you might have to just chunk this and edit.
No problem. I love it when people come on and you can feel their passion through the screen and through your voice. So we're going to have a great podcast. So thanks for the introduction of your background. So just quickly then, what handicap are we both playing off at the minute?
Oh, I'm not telling you that. I've gone up this summer, so no, you can't ask a lady your handicap.
Is that one? Is it? Carl, can we ask you?
I don't have one. If I can get past 6 holes at my golf club, there's a loop that comes, but the fourth hole comes back to the clubhouse, and I rarely get past 4. So my handicap is now how many holes I actually play.
Love it. Love it. Two psychologists in golf who won't reveal their handicaps. Does that say anything?
I also don't play with him. I also don't play with anyone. I only play on my own. So as a psychologist, I often say I'm like the builder who hasn't done his own bathroom. I feel like I've got a lot to offer this space, but probably haven't addressed my own my own golf.
At least I'm still playing. I'm coming through this choking journey less scarred, I think, because I still play relatively competitively. I don't play for county or anything like that anymore, or obviously nowhere near Wales. But I still do play, and I live in that because I do play socially. And so I do play 18 holes, and I do still have a single figure handicap, but I'm leaving it at that.
Okay, we'll leave it at that.
Do you see what Denise did there? She realised she was miles better than me, and then decided to
add it.
We'll be playing for money after this.
Well,
you won't, because Carl was mentioning to me before. I think you'd stopped playing for quite a while, and now you found the enjoyment again, but just by playing on your own. Is that right, Carl? Is that?
Yeah, that's my story. I'm also antisocial, as you know, Martin. So yeah, playing on my own.
That's nothing to do with it, Martin. No one to play with him.
Well, I won't, because I'm shocking. So we will leave that there. So you guys have clubbed together, and I think historically you've wanted to do this for a while, Denise. So you have a book coming out soon, and it's called, I think, The Psychology of Golf Performance Under Pressure, and it's edited by you guys and Jamie Barker. Denise, can you give us a background on where that's come from and what the book is?
Okay, so this is something I want to do for absolute years, decades, probably 15 years, maybe even 20, got to be honest, years in the making. I can remember sitting down with, funny enough, it was at the time of Karl's PhD viva. So when was that? That'll age it, because his other external examiner was Brian Hemmings, another really good golf psychologist in this space. And we were just talking about the fact that there's a huge gap in the market for information for coaches, practitioners, parents, golfers, that is really evidence-based, that can really just help them manage themselves better under pressure, manage the demands of golf, and come through it in a way that, yes, their performance is good, but ultimately they can enjoy it more. They can get pleasure from playing golf, from training, from developing, and really understanding how to get the best out of themselves, how to get the best out of their son if their son plays golf, as a parent, or a coach, knowing how to deliver information to their group of golfers to ensure that they're practicing effectively, etc. There's we talked about this earlier, didn't we? There's a disconnect between scholarship and practitioners at times. There's all this wonderful empirical evidence out there about how any athlete can develop effectively, the talent pathway. And then when they get to the elite level, to be able to manage the demands of that far better. There's so much information on that, but disseminating it to where it really matters in terms of the coaches, practitioners and athletes themselves, there seems to be a challenge there and a disconnect. And that was no exception in golf. And for sure, just having conversation with golfers and people I work with, and people I play with, and people who coached me and coached others, it's like, well, why are you doing that? Why are you asking your athlete to practice that way? Why are you thinking this way under pressure? Have you not considered this? So that's where the book came from. It's really try to help everybody. So that's the novel and brilliant thing about this book, I have to say. Don't mind saying that we've tried to hit such a wide audience so that it is still a scholarly book that fits in university libraries, but actually it can be in a pro shop. It can be picked up by psychology practitioners, it can be picked up by an S&C coach, it can be picked up by a parent of someone whose kid is going through the developmental pathway, and actually and organizations, golfing organizations, can be picked up by everybody, and there's something of use there that can help them with the talent pathway, enable this developmental pathway to be as effective and as efficient and as enjoyable as possible. It's just some easy, quick wins in there. And every chapter has been written by a world leader in their field who is involved in scholarship, involved in evidence-based practice, and involved in golf. So it's a global book. It's really, really proud of it, and just so grateful for all the authors who contributed, and obviously to Karl and Jamie who supported the editorial process. And of course, got to give a big shout to Taylor and Francis and Routledge, who picked this up and ran with the idea a few years ago. And then to be honest, it did pick up, and it's taken us about 2 years to get this together now, from just conversations, and then we got it done. So uber proud, and it's out next month, and can't wait to see it in print.
Brilliant. Thanks for the detail on that. We will be touching upon a small section, I suppose, of the book, but of more of your research around performing under pressure and choking. So let's get into it straight away with what is choking.
Do you want to start?
Well, just to see the silence. I think what's in and I think Denise will be best positioned to start this conversation in a second. But I think the context for the conversation is the bridging between research and applied work, and the real lived experience that Denise has tried to really capture in her work. I think the biggest challenge for me and the biggest interest for me is how popular media, how the layperson might label someone as a joke. And Denise shared her own experience of being called a joker, the impact of that label that might not fit the experience of the person having performed the action. And I give the example a lot that, someone in golf, for example, could miss a 6-foot putt to win the Open. But they could miss that putt because they've misread the green and technically performed a perfect putt. that a commentator and the public might label that as a choke because of how important it was. Equally, that person could hold that putt, but again, they've misread the green. Physiologically, they've had an involuntary movement, or they have, or nerves or anxiety have played a part in that stroke not being successful. But the ball's ultimately gone in, and they haven't been labelled a choker. And I find that really problematic. It's not about whether it's the right definition or wrong definition. It's like I'm not sure how helpful that is. So when I look at the research over the last 20 or 30 years, I think I've got to the point where I'm less concerned whether it's an accurate definition. I think my criticism from an applied perspective is I don't know how useful that definition is in terms of, and we'll get onto it later on, of whether we can help people resist the experience or whatever. So for me, I still think, and Denise may say otherwise, I think there's a slight gap between how choking is talked about in the world in which we're trying to research it for versus what research says about it. I don't know if that makes any sense, Denise.
I like this. Let's start with critical debate on what choking is. It's a good start. So Denise, go for it.
It's a nightmare, isn't it? It's an absolute minefield. And this is from where I'm coming from, research, and where we're both coming from, research-informed practitioners. It's like, well, obviously we've got to get the evidence in terms of, right, what is choking and what causes it? You would think this would be a really simple question. And obviously, in order to achieve that, you need to do studies with individuals who have experienced choking, explore their experience, test and evaluate, interventions to see if they alleviate choking, and a way to go. That has just simply not happened in the choking literature, because way back when I talk about, the original research, that was based on a definition by Baumeister, which was basically any decrement in performance under pressure was considered choking. So what we understood about choking was in a lab-based, and they put pressure on golfers or, students, saw that the performance lowered a tiny bit, called that choking, evaluated the mechanism of a choke, and that was it. So for a good, I say 10, 15 years, the cause of choking from that definition was considered to be something called self-focus, where you basically try to control and monitor your own technique as you were swinging. And of course, there may be golfers out there listening to this now going, oh, I do that. I think about my technique when I swing. And yeah, if you do that and you're an elite performer, it's not a good thing to do, and it could lead to choking. It could do. But ultimately, that understanding arrived from a definition that really did not reflect people's experience of choking. So that's where we came along in 2009 and tried to explore self-reported choking. What do you think it is? You say you've experienced this. What is it? And we did come up with different definitions, which was more along the lines of a significant or acute drop in performance. That is really caused by a raised anxiety. And there's been a few iterations since then. And we're not there yet. We're certainly not there yet. But what we do know is, the individual perceives that they've been unable to cope with the demands of the situation, and that they have experienced, a catastrophic or acute or dramatic failure of skill execution and performance. So there is for sure work to do there, but that's kind of it. When you ask anyone who's experienced a choke, what is it like? They will come up with those kind of words. It is very different from an underperformance or a bad day or a mistake. There is another step towards what athletes consider a choke, generally speaking, and there's obviously going to be anomalies and exceptions to that, but that's the direction of travel in our research. So our definition is around those lines at the moment, individually perceived, an experience where you have a lack of control over yourself, and where the performance and execution is significantly different from what you would normally perform. Does that sort of make sense? Which isn't that different from what Karl has just said.
No, Denise, do you agree that means that from that perspective, and real life isn't like that, it means no commentator or observer really is in a position to ever label something as a joke, because it is an experiential and qualitatively different thing to underperformance. All they can comment on is a performance outcome, which may or may not be a choke. And I think from a from a usefulness perspective, I think that's maybe it's an education thing, maybe it's opportunities like this, but until we bridge that gap and if that's the way it goes, that choking is something that only the person experiencing it can identify with. The fact that you were labelled as a choker back in the day, Denise, may or may not have been true, but the label will have had an effect on you, I'm sure. And so even I find we have some PhD students now that are researching in this area. Recruiting participants to choking research is really difficult because they're self-identifying as chokers based on the various definitions of what choking is in the first place. So it feels a little tricky.
I mean, it's a mess, isn't it, really? Because exactly, you self-identify as choking. Why? Where does that come from? Or do you fit the definition, etc.? So we're having a circular argument there. But ultimately, when we've engaged in studies try to get participants who in a choking study, whatever it is, is there a continuum of performances really, and where does that performance really fit for you? And actually, it can, in answer to your first question, can someone external identify a choke? I think they can, but only in the extreme cases. I don't think anyone would argue that when McElroy had his choke in the Masters, I think we could all see it was a choke and he confirmed it afterwards. But for sure, it was important that he did confirm it afterwards, that his performance and losing the Masters by 10 shots in the end was a choke by anyone's definition and observations and his experience. But yeah, I think that's how we're building up an understanding, isn't it? Through the qualitative research and particularly, understanding the phenomenology, the lived experience of choking. We're now building up kind of like a picture where we could possibly measure it more objectively, and then external individuals could go, it would appear that they have choked, just as we built up a picture of any other construct, mental toughness, whatever, we built up a picture of it and now we can measure it. And I kind of think we are on that journey with choking, but it's been a struggle. It's been a struggle to actually shift thinking towards building this picture, but we are getting there. But yeah, I agree with everything you say. It's a lived experience. So really only that individuals who've lived it can say, that feels like something that I would label as a choke because it was extreme, because it was unusual, because it was acute, because it was dramatic, because it was absolutely caused by me unable to cope and regulate under the demands of this situation. I simply capitulated. Now, I kind of think that kind of narrative has got to be associated with a choke rather than, as I did on Tuesday, went out in the rain, played terribly, club was slipping out of my hands. I gave up because I really couldn't be doing with it, and shot, 15 over. That's no choke. It might have seemed like a choke to other people looking at it, but it was no choke because I gave up. It wasn't the demands of the situation. It was the fact that I wanted to go in for a cup of tea.
or a whiskey. Yeah, it might have been if I was doing that.
People who know me were laughing at that because they know I did not go in for a cup of tea.
So in terms of the choking, you mentioned a lot there about kind of self-identification of this phenomenon. Because some people I spoke to, a friend of mine plays quite high level amateur golf. So he plays off, I think it's about +3. He's won national amateur tournaments. And I spoke to him and he basically doesn't think choking exists. He was totally against it. He thinks it's more people just selecting a bad shot. Or he also talked about the caddy's involvement, which I thought was an interesting part. And he would quote, specific shots at specific times and suggest that it was a misselection of a shot and chose to play the shot that player is not capable of playing or often misses, but chose to do it in a pressure environment. So I suppose my long-winded question there is, how many people actually experience choking, and are there kind of ways that you can know that somebody might, or is it no, you just don't know, and then once you experience it, then you can accept it's true?
Just to pick up on the caddy point first, and I think that's what is great about the book, that the way that Denise has outlined how it's structured. From an applied perspective, whenever I'm going into a place of work, I'm always looking at who's best positioned to deliver the psychology. And I'll say a lot, it's not about the psychologist, it really is about the psychology. And the caddy is, as your friend suggests, is uniquely positioned to perhaps create those right climates, environments around the player. So they certainly can be an influence in helping someone perform under pressure. I don't recognise the other description or explanation of those poor shots at all. As influential as a caddy is, there's no player that plays at the highest level that I've experienced that would hand over their whole decision-making process to a caddy. I guess as we started out 5 or 6 minutes ago, there's a difference between decision-making errors and execution errors and skill breakdown and things like that. They are very different things. But yeah, sorry, I just wanted to make the point that the caddy is important. I don't recognise it as being as important that, but decision making under pressure and that going awry, I mean that might fall into the category. I have some thoughts on that process choking, if you like. That speaks to my point about I don't think the outcome can truly tell you whether someone's choked, and I think it's important that if I were working with someone and they fell over the line and won a tournament, but within there was a choking experience. If we're only using outcome to tell us, then we've missed some important learning in terms of what we need to do to make them robust to go forward. So I think there's a reluctance to be labelled as a choke, which is why a lot of golfers I talk to might think it doesn't exist, because who wants to acknowledge that it does? But equally, I think it's important to separate outcome from the choking experience or a process breakdown so that we can develop and help and support people that might be susceptible to that.
I was just going to add to that, Karl. I agree with everything. And in terms of it not existing, well, there's been, I suppose, thousands now interviews with individuals who consider that they have choked and can distinguish it from other performance errors. And ultimately, that is the key, isn't it, Karl? In terms of what we consider to be a choke at the moment, it is a breakdown in skill execution, from normal standards. By some there's a sense that there's just a total lack of control, perceived control, and ability to cope, and it's quite an acute. It is perceived as a very acute and dramatic drop and experience of performance failure. So in terms of your friend, I hope it doesn't exist for him. From my point of view, from the research we've done so far, choking isn't that common. Choking doesn't happen to everybody all of the time. In terms of susceptibility, there does appear to be choking susceptible profiles out there, but the work that's gone into that has come up with nothing in terms of what the profile might look like. We certainly know that there are some moderators that increase the likelihood of choking. The obvious ones in terms of high trait anxiety, high levels of self-consciousness or low. We were talking about self-presentation, people who are very concerned about what other people think, they tend to be vulnerable. Those who are perfectionists, or certainly dysfunctional perfectionists, seem to be more vulnerable. And so there are other moderators that one of our colleagues, Chris Mazzano over in Australia, he does a lot of work in this in terms of trying to understand the dispositions, and he actually chooses participants for his study based on those kinds of criteria that are high in all of these things, and therefore may well choke under pressure, and see if they do. So we're building up a picture of what increase the likelihood, but it's a perfect storm. And when individuals do choke, it's a very powerful experience that can be constructive. You look at McIlroy's a really good example of this. When he choked after the Masters, he went on to win then the US Open, the very next Open. And he says very clearly, if it wasn't for that choking experience, I wouldn't have won this. I learned so much about myself, la, la, la. But of course, for some people, unfortunately, we know this from our work, it's a very destructive experience. It can be a very destructive experience, so you use it to beat yourself up, basically. And as a result of that, they do become pretty vulnerable to repeated chokes over time. So for some people, they can become susceptible, but there's a lot more work to be done on that.
The shame is, if we just think about golf, some of the moments that come to mind over the years I've been watching golf. I think of Doug Sanders' 1970 Open Championship. I think of Scott Hoke, one of the first tournaments ever watched, US Masters 89, missing a 2-3 foot putt. I think of Jean Van der Velde, 1999 in the Open Championship, 3-shot lead with 1 hole to play. Greg Norman, 5-shot lead, ends up losing by 6. We don't have access to these real life experience that seem to be or get talked about as a choke to understand whether they do fit that criteria. And I've watched a few interviews with Jean van der Velde over the years who seems to stand firm that it wasn't, and he would do exactly the same again. But to the rest of the world, you're thinking, hang on a minute, you got 3-shot lead in the Open Championship, you made 7, you lost in a play. It feels like a choke, but then it goes back to my point. On one level, if the person hasn't experienced the choke, then perhaps it isn't, but also there's denial as well, I guess. But again, it's about how useful it is. But like you say, McIlroy went on to respond in a positive way to that experience, whereas you could argue Jean van der Velde didn't have too many wins, if any, after that experience.
He didn't, but he does admit that it was the end of his career. So whatever that experience was, it was pretty damaging, wasn't it?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, in terms of a label. And I did say this way back when we started this in 2009, when we started this research. Perhaps we should call it something else, because the label is really derogatory. And maybe that would help. I don't know.
Well, can we dig into a few of those bits, because we're almost going through the kind of whole story regarding kind of why it happens and then the kind of impacts on it, and we've not quite touched on kind of how we can potentially avoid it. But you mentioned things like self-focus, self-presentation, as factors and self-consciousness. So can you just give us like some in-depth of one of those examples? So I think about this from my perspective. I got to 40. All my mates play golf. Thought, okay, I'm gonna have to start playing golf just to hang out. And I remember there's a couple of holes locally here where I'll play, and there's a lake right in front of it. And I know the first few times I played on that lake, it was like, don't hit it into the lake. So obviously I hit it into the lake, and then I purposely myself just go, there isn't a lake there. Like, hit it over there, and I now don't hit it in the lake. Now, whether that's just a natural thing or whether not all the time. You know what? Next time I go, I'll text you. I'll probably will hit it into the lake. But that's whether that's just being around sports science and thinking, do you know what? Let's frame this positively. Let's visualize something. You know, whether I've just put some techniques in or whether I've just got a bit better and can hit it better. I don't know. But in terms of that kind of self-consciousness, or how you want to present yourself, can you talk us through like a golfer and how that might manifest?
There's two schools of thought, really. Actually, no, not two schools of thought anymore. We know that there are really two pathways. From our understanding, there's two main pathways to choking. So one of which I alluded to earlier, which is the self-focus. When someone who's under pressure and experiences a lot of anxiety, they really want to do well, or they really want to avoid failure, or whatever it is, they feel pressure, they feel anxiety. And as a result of that, they focus on themselves and they go, right, God, make sure that elbow's in, make sure that, I do really get that left hip out of the way. So they think very much on a technical level. So that's explicit monitoring, explicit control, whatever you want to call it. It is self-focusing on the technical elements of your swing. Thing is, as we know, the best way to execute anything is automatically when it's well learned. So it's like, Karl learnt the swing, obviously knows it automatically, stands on the first tee. We're all berating him and expecting greatness because he's a PGA pro. We're all, all these expectations are on him. There's lots of money riding, for him, probably 50p a hole. For us, big money. But so all of this pressure comes on him. So it's like, right, I really need to drive this down the middle. Right, what was I? Got to get these shoulders sorted. I've got to get the weight onto the right foot and so on. So all of these technical thoughts being processed through the mind is obviously very, very debilitating to the execution. So you're thinking like a beginner. You're going to play like a beginner. And that's exactly what happens. So if Karl's thinking like that on the first tee, he's going to numpty it into the jungle on the right. And we take the many. Brilliant. The other pathway is, as you've alluded to, Martin, and that's distraction. It's actually thinking about something other than what you need to. So thinking about, so basically distraction by could be internal thoughts such as worry, or it could even be positive thoughts. Doug Sanders, the story is, and Karl correct me on this because he's far, far, far older than I am, but He was actually having positive thoughts over that missed putt, over what he considered to be a choke, because this is the story, was actually thinking which part of the crowd to wave to after he sank the putt and won, obviously, the Open. That may be a myth, that's just been perpetuated, but certainly there is opportunity to choke simply because you are thinking about the wrong things, whether it's positive or negative, thinking about that lake, thinking about what's for tea, thinking about not failure, and in terms of self-presentation, worrying what other people will think of you. And that's huge in choking, a need to manage the impression, look good. I don't want to look incompetent. I don't want to fail. I certainly don't want to fail in front of those people, those selectors, those crowds, my peers, good players, and all of this anxiety comes in. And if, again, you're processing those thoughts through your mind, your working memory, you are not in a position to execute the skill at all, and you choke. So we've got self-focus and distraction as your mechanism. So we've got loads and loads of factors that simply come together to create this anxiety that then goes on to affect us in different ways. And some people seem to be vulnerable to the self-focus. Some people seem to be far more vulnerable to the distraction. Certainly our recent research has shifted the evidence, because we used to think from the early work that most people choke through self-focus. More qualitative work over the last 10 years has shown that actually most people are vulnerable to choking through distraction, it would appear. But of course, self-focus absolutely does happen. And unfortunately, I include myself in this, there are individuals who are vulnerable to choke through distraction and self-focus. So go figure. That's not a good place to be, but that's the mechanism as we know it.
That's very well explained. Loads of detail there. So that's brilliant. And obviously very broad. So obviously different experiences for different people might happen. So as researchers and practitioners, how do we get over this or prepare for this? So let's talk about preparing for it. So people who may not have choked before, but we know it may be able to happen. Are there psychological methods that you can use to help players to avoid this happening?
So I'm just reminded while Denise is speaking there, my first day as an undergrad and a mature student, because I'd come to this after being a golf professional, I picked up a paper by Rich Masters, and it was just like the guide for my degree, really, just to understand reading journal articles and things like this. I picked up this paper, Knowledge, Nerves and Know-How, that talked about the build-up of declarative knowledge and building up rules on how to do something, and it really reflected my own experience in golf. I have very few regrets in life. I don't have any regrets, really, but I know something that shaped my golf experience was turning pro at a driving range. And I stood on the driving range with a video camera, having lessons all the time. I was fascinated by the golf swing, but I built up a lot of rules about how to swing the club. And I used to play with colleagues that were pros at golf clubs that just learned to get the ball in the hole. They would lasso it around their head a couple of times. They'd up and down it out of dustbins. They learned to play the game, where I was learning to swing the golf club. And this paper really spoke to me and my experience, that over the years I've built up all of these rules on how to do it. And then under pressure and under a bit of importance, I would, as Masters went on to look at, reinvest that knowledge. And that, for me, was my experience of the skill breaking down, at least even if it wasn't choking. The second memory that comes to mind is playing Open Championship qualifying. I tell my students this a lot because it gives them a laugh. But I threw up on the first tee of Open Championship. That's my claim to fame. And people often think that it's because there was out of bounds right and there was a small crowd on the left-hand side. But I've got a silly surname. Well, I certainly did 20 years ago. People are too young now to remember that there was a program called Steptoe and Son. So my anxiety was the fact that there was a guy in a blazer that was about to call my name on the tee. And I would be so concerned from a self-presentation perspective that the crowd were going to laugh because on the tee from England or whatever was Karl Steptoe. And that anxiety, that fear of something that was nothing to do with golf would really affect the execution of my skill. And my coach would see that and say, oh, we need to work on your shoulder turn. It's nothing to do with my shoulder turn. The reason I haven't made a shoulder turn is I just want to get this over and done with it as quick as possible. So they're two experiences that stand out. The answer to your question, I guess one of those questions starts in how you learn the skill in the first place is one way that we can potentially resist the chances of this happening in the future. And sorry, one other, not research experience I've had, but over the years as a coach and an applied practitioner, some of the best performers that I've been fortunate to work with in any sport, I find it very difficult to tell other people how they do it because they don't have access to that declarative knowledge. You know, the way they learnt the game was different to me. When I hear them explain a complicated shot like a bunker shot, they get to this point in their explanation where it's almost like, and then you just do it because they don't know the component parts. So for me, that whole experience from both ends suggests that if we can reduce that build-up, people that seem to perform well under pressure for me have learnt the game in a different way, and they certainly practice it in a different way. What are you laughing at, Denise? You're still laughing at my surname, aren't you?
No, oh bless you. Well, your impression motivation is so high. No, I just knew, I was just smiling because I knew this is going to turn into a therapy session for both of us. You know, it's like this podcast is going to be 3 hours of us going. And then what I did was shanked it and nearly took out a Welsh elector because that was when I decided to walk off the horse. So yeah, so I mean, yeah, it's. People want that $1 million answer, don't they? In terms of, I choke, what do I do? What can I do about it? And it's always the difficult. It's always a difficult stage of the interview, and in this case, the podcast, because it's not that simple, unfortunately. So for sure, you know, the perfect, and going back to the book, I think that's a really good place to start because we do go through the developmental process all the way through to the elite performance. So coaches should have a little look at this and go, in terms of what Karl's talking about, actually, if you teach in a way that's far more implicit and use analogies and so on, the individual is building up their swing without this explicit component, this technical components that are reinvested, Karl calls it, that you focus on under pressure. So if I had been taught the skill and Karl had been taught the skill in a more broader way, vague way, abstract way with these pictures and these analogies, us standing on the first tee being very anxious, we wouldn't have been able to self-focus on a technique because there was nothing to focus on, and we would have been in a much better position to be able to execute the swing. So I find that bit is really important. But of course, that's not the end of the story. We can still choke through distraction. And actually, there's a hell of a lot of elite performers who do have a lot of this explicit knowledge. And so we need to work with them. And, you know, and there are a range of techniques that can be used, but it's all individually tailored. So, you know, it's a given that every golfer should have a pre-shot routine. You know, it's a given that there should be some behavioral and cognitive components of those, you know, using imagery to see the target and having a little wiggle to relax those muscles, or have a little deep breath, or whatever it is that works for you. It's a given that kind of stuff is there. But we also need to change our relationship with anxiety, as that seems to be the key emotion that's driving these mechanisms. So do we lower anxiety? That's okay to a point. You know, we can use the breathing exercises. You can pretend that it's not important. That doesn't get you very far, I have to say, because it is important. Otherwise, you wouldn't be feeling anxious. And anxiety is actually a good component for our performances. So perhaps we need to restructure our relationship with anxiety and use it as our friend. It's there for a reason. And actually, you know, the conversations that we're having a lot now as applied practitioners, you know, someone comes to me, I'm very anxious, I don't want to feel anxious anymore. Actually, the conversation is, you're anxious, good. Let's change our relationship rather than lower it. And, you know, we can do this, you know, if Jamie was here, he would be talking about, you know, the cognitive restructuring in terms of REBT and using strategies to, you know, appraise anxiety and the demands in a far more facilitative way. And I think I'm going to hand over to Karl, because this is the way that I like to go as well, which is more an acceptance of anxiety. And a commitment to play in a way that is moment-to-moment focus and play into your values. And that's me setting you up for your chapter, really, yeah, Karl, because it's just the way to go for a lot of chokers.
Yeah, I mean, the focus of a lot of we've talked about here is a mechanistic view of choking, and that's where we've been for a while. We're starting and with our doctoral researchers now, we're starting to look at this subject from a slightly different and in some ways old lens, a bit more behaviourally and a more functional way. So rather than explaining the cause and looking at the content of someone's experience, we're looking at the function of it. Okay, what do those thoughts make you do? What are those feelings? How do you respond to those feelings when they show up? So a lot of the suggestions and recommendations out there, as Denise says, are designed to help reduce, control, stop, manage the unwanted inner experiences, the unhelpful thoughts, feelings, and emotions. And my experience of that is, if it works at all, it's temporary. That's not going to get rid of that experience. You're going to have to do that all over again tomorrow and the next day and the next day. And when you're working with the men and women that are playing 3-4 days in a row, suddenly you can have performance decrement because your efforts to manage this anxiety for 3 days is going to come at a cost to performance. So the way we're starting to look at it now, Denise mentioned acceptance. It doesn't mean put up with. It just means you've got to make room for what is a very natural experience. I haven't played golf competitively in 15 years. You put me on the first tee now, the same feelings are going to show up, you know, and I might not even be playing. I can even think myself into that emotion. I was telling you about playing British Open and throwing up. That was 23 years ago. If I thought about that long and hard, sat here in this room right here, right now, I could still feel some of those things and the embarrassment show up. And it's not even happening because that's how minds work. So if thoughts and feelings are automatic and unavoidable, then maybe there's a different way of, as Denise says, of how we relate to them, and we can choose how we respond to them. But we've got to make room for that. And as I say to a lot of the people I work with, if you're waiting to play your best golf until those thoughts go, you're going to have a long wait. You know, so maybe we've got to look at how we respond, and that's where the choice is. So it's an exciting area. I'm really looking forward to it. As Denise says, there's one chapter in the book that starts to propose that as an idea, but we're just starting out on that road. And my hope is that doesn't give us a better version of choking. It just might be a bit more. I believe it's going to be a bit more useful.
Do you have any kind of early practical kind of ideas or examples on that? So on that golfer who's playing 3 or 4 days and how they can attempt to manage that anxiety or accept that anxiety. Have you got any early thoughts on that if the research isn't fully there?
There's research there for techniques and strategies that will help. Don't get me wrong. If I'm working with a golfer or a caddy and they're going down the stretch, I will give them something to do. I would suggest and hope that they use a strategy that will help them control and manage those thoughts in that moment. But what I would hope in our work together is that they both know that that's a strategy to maintain focus and attention, and it might last for that shot. But it's certainly not going to be a one-time thing that means that my anxiety is gone forever. So for me, it becomes a combination of getting people into performance states, which are short-term and quite effortful. But long-term, I want you to have a relationship with your thoughts, feelings, and emotion, which means that you've got choice in how you respond. So all of my golfers, I make them uncomfortable, mentally uncomfortable. I want them to get up in the morning and first thing is just recognize that you're a thinking machine. So I've got players playing in DP World Tour this week, and the first thing I'd want them to do on a Thursday morning is wake up. Even though Wednesday night you've left me a voice note saying how well you're hitting it, I bet you've slept the night and you've woken up this morning and doubt shown up and nothing's happened. You've just slept. So before we hand over our day to doubt and uncertainty, should we just wait for 30 seconds, recognize the thoughts, feelings, and emotions that are showing up and look at how we respond to those? Because that's the narrative that I hear a lot. People just hitting balls on the range on a Wednesday night and not leaving until it goes well. The only thing that will do is make you sleep better. It will have very little carryover till tomorrow morning, because I know Thursdays are a trigger for doubt and uncertainty. And you can carry that through to Friday afternoon when there's a cut and Sunday afternoon when, So there are techniques that I'd use from that perspective, but then there's lots of other techniques that can help people get into that state, relaxation, quiet eye drills. Yeah, Denise, there's loads, right?
So can you just, we're going to run out of time fairly soon. You give us just like one practical example. So you get the message on the Wednesday night and then the same Thursday morning, and the players starting to feel that doubt as an example. And I'm very aware that, for many people it's different and it's individual, but just as an example, what kind of things might one of your players be doing?
I'll try and give you a practical example. Everyone is different. That's a given. Okay. But when you understand how someone uniquely responds to, let's use anxiety as an emotion, So you have to understand how someone responds to their anxiety to understand what you'd encourage them to do. So a lot of players that I work with, if I'm walking around the golf course, you can tell they're thinking and feeling something because their behaviour changed. So I'll see the player walk 10 yards ahead of his caddy. I'll see him go quiet. I'll see his head go down and those sorts of things. So we over a lot of conversations and understanding of the athlete, you try and understand, if I could rip that anxiety out of you right now, if I could get rid of the doubt, the uncertainty, the nerves, what would you be doing? And that's very much in behavioural terms. They can really relate to the fact that, Karl, if you help me get rid of my nerves and anxiety, I will play head up, smiling. I'll swing with freedom and speed. And okay, well, this just becomes a choice. Are you willing to swing with speed with the thought, I'm going to hit it left and out of bounds? So it's just from my flavour of psychology, that's what we would be doing. So my reinforcement of what players do is to really acknowledge the fact that even though I know they were feeling something uncomfortable, they slowed down. They carried on talking to their playing partners. When the crowd give them an applause for it going in and they're thinking, oh my God, that was lucky, they look up, they smile. It's them playing and being the player they want to be, even though, and this is where Denise made the point about acceptance, even though they've got to make room for the fact that, oh my God, this is really fragile, it's all going to go wrong, because those thoughts aren't going anywhere.
From my point, this just given just a snippet, hemispheric priming, something that's come in, it's very much a cognitive behavioural, so it's away from the acceptance, but decent research actually out there that simply clenching the left hand a few times activates parts of the brain that encourage us to execute the skill automatically. So a guy called Beckman out in Germany, I can't think what university he's out, so people want to go and have a look at his research. He's demonstrated over and over again, actually, if we can do this across sports, that it is actually what it's. I won't bore people with the details. They can read it if they want, but ultimately simply doing that, that self-focus, that analytical aspect, thinking about the components, thinking about other things, that activates parts of the brain that are really unhelpful, obviously, and simply doing that allows us to the other side of the brain to take over a little bit and encourage more automatic execution of skills. So people should try that. It doesn't work for everyone, but the evidence base is really quite strong on that. And in terms of aligned with the acceptance, which may be other people's preferred philosophy, this one for the dinner table, the next dinner party, cognitive diffusion, it is, these thoughts and feelings that are really uncomfortable coming into your mind, rather than try and block them out, because that's no good. Blocking out negative thoughts is ironic processing. It doesn't help you. You need to engage with them. You need to process them. You need to do something with them. Okay. And process them on. And I think, Karl, you were telling me, and this was something that one of my players picked up on, was actually putting them, imagining these thoughts on a placard in the crowd. Was that you telling me that?
Yeah. So the traditional, there's some typical approaches to mindfulness and diffusion where you would imagine leaves on a stream, but if you can engage with the person you're working with, their real life context, that these metaphors can become more meaningful. And one of them was to imagine your thoughts and feelings on placards being held up by the crowd. And it just helps you get that distance from those thoughts. So yeah, trying to make these examples relevant to the population you're working with, I think is always useful.
Yeah, well, so one of my players, she loved that. I mean, but instead of on a placard, it was kind of like people standing with T-shirts with the words, and whatever. So sometimes you're engaging, you're processing with these thoughts, and you're kind of like distancing yourself. So, we're going back to that, having a different relationship with the anxiety and the negative thoughts and the positive thoughts that are coming with you. And then, as you say, committing then to playing with your values, because that's what's so freeing, to be able to go, that's how I'm feeling. I got all these doubts, whatever, but I play with flair. I play with aggression, not me personally, but that's how I am going to play my golf, because that's the only way I can sustain a career in this game, is to play authentically the way I want to play, regardless of what, because it's actually irrelevant how I think and how I feel. It's totally irrelevant. I am going to smash this ball to the centre of the green with a draw, because that's what I do. I got my processes that I trust that can send it that way. That's the only way I can play, is with those values and take that forward. So yeah, it's difficult. It's not something, this is what you should do, because it's so individually tailored to what people will respond to, agree with, and fits in with their training.
I think again, bringing us back to the start, I think anyone listening to this who thinks that this is something that they want to overcome, I think it's something really helpful. It's just to believe that it is possible. I think one of the problems with the label of choking is it feels so definite. And Denise said maybe we need a different word for it. There are ways through this. There are ways of playing with the experience, regardless of what your approach is to this. I think one of the most helpful interventions is just to not see this thing as so debilitating that you can't enjoy your golf or play or perform at a high level again. And that might just give that confidence to keep working through. So it's not like this thing that you're just stuck with. You know, there are ways through it.
Well, can be a very constructive experience, actually. Yeah.
Well, like I say, I think we're kind of coming towards a close, but I think organically you guys have kind of simplified something that is very complex towards the end there, and do correct me if I'm wrong with this oversimplification, but it seems that players just need to accept that they are going to get anxious, and if they accept that and don't try and avoid that, or don't dwell on the negatives and actually just accept these are going to happen, but this is how I can deal with it, then that might be one way of helping. And again, there are so many complexities, and I'm going to throw the mic over to you guys in a moment to kind of close on, you know, really why people should look at the book, because, you know, there must be so many methods. And I think it's clear from you guys that you can't really say, okay, go and just visualize this, do this technique beforehand, take some deep breaths, and you're going to be brilliant at golf, because that's not the answer. But that's what everybody wants to hear. But that's not the answer. The answer is potentially, let's just deal with it, like as in accept that it's there and look at you personally and how that can move forward. And the book hopefully has lots of techniques and ideas. And I think individualizing that to your situation is potentially how people might get beyond this. I'll pass over to you to finish. Correct any of that if I'm wrong.
Yeah, I'll go first and let Denise finish on a bit. But I think the only thing I winced at, because I think it was a great summation, Martin, but that English language is really important in this, and that word accept tends to not land well with people. It is make room for. It's not put up with. It's not, oh my God, I'm resigned to feeling like this. But you have to make room for the fact that thinking is part of being human, and it's a gift and curse in equal measure. So when people are saying, when we do say accept, you're absolutely right, but more in terms of make room for what is a very normal experience. The best athletes in the world have the most horrific thoughts. They've just learned to respond to them in a very different way through various techniques. And I think the book tees that up nicely. Denise?
So absolutely, there's 14 chapters in this book, and each of them end with take-home messages of applied techniques. So there is a chapter in there that's dedicated to choking that myself and Chris Mazzano has written. And again, half of it is techniques that are evidence-based to alleviate and in some cases prevent choking. So that's great. But every single chapter has a message that can be used for the reader. In terms of, there's one on parents, on resilience, on being in a challenge state rather than a threat state. There's a threat state does bring out choking, whereas a challenge state is one where you're using the anxiety and the pressure in your advantage. And I could go on. So for sure, and very precise techniques that you can use in training, in practice, and then on the course that everyone can bring into their game to simply improve their experience of performing under pressure. And that's really what it's all about, because if we just it's meant to be a joy. Golf is played for fun, whether it's you're a 54 handicapper or on the tour. Bringing in the money, it's got to be enjoyable. Otherwise, you haven't got longevity. What is the point in playing if you haven't got joy? And that's what it's all about. The whole book is about understanding how to bring out the best in yourself when you are exposed to pressure. And I got to be honest, I'm probably being a little bit too grand here, but I think some of these messages can go into other domains, in terms of how to manage yourself. Pressure situations can go into, exam, your driving test, or, other things that are happening in life. It's basically human functioning at its best. So for sure, every chapter has a take-home message for the whole range of audiences that we talked about earlier. So yeah, it's a good one. So it's out next month, people. Go buy.
Denise, Karl, really appreciate you coming on. I hope that our listeners have got a flavour and some understanding of choking, along with a couple of techniques. But like you said there, this is just a real opener for everybody. I hope you guys have gone through this therapy session and have got something out of it yourselves. I certainly have. So really appreciate it. As you said, great book. Go out and buy it. And do feel free to contact myself or Karl and Denise if you want to kind of look at research further on this, or you want some more understanding. Then go for it. Thanks for having you on. I'm sure we will speak again soon.
Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Martin.
Enjoy.
Thanks for listening to the Experts in Sport podcast. If you'd like to get in touch, then please contact me, Martin Foster, at m.foster@loughborough.ac.uk. Thanks for listening. See you next time.